My name is Margaret Hill. I am 65 years old. That evening, I was standing in an event center in the suburbs of Ohio, where my son was getting married. Warm yellow lights filled the hall. Tables and chairs were neatly arranged. Glasses clinked softly. The background music was gentle, so perfect that anyone might have thought it was an ideal night. I held a glass of water in my hand, but I couldn't drink it. My ears began to ring, as if someone had turned the volume of the entire room down. The laughter and conversations around me grew distant. I could still see everyone, but it felt as though I were standing behind a thin sheet of glass. On the stage, Emily Carter was holding the microphone. She wore a white wedding dress, her face radiant, her posture confident. It was the posture of someone who knew she was being listened to. Daniel stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on his wife's back, smiling at the guests. Emily said a few words of thanks. She thanked both families. She thanked her friends. She thanked everyone for coming to celebrate. Her voice was steady and clear, with nothing unusual in it. Then she paused for a moment, and she said, "As the new wife of your son, I'm very happy to say that I am allowing my mother-in-law to move into my old apartment." For the first moment, I didn't understand what that sentence had to do with me. Then the entire hall applauded. The applause rose all at once, warm and well-meaning. I looked around. A few people turned toward me and smiled. There were looks of approval, as if I had just been granted something generous and kind. There were also looks of pity, quick, subtle, but I still saw them. My hand trembled slightly. The glass tapped softly against the table. I tried to swallow a sip of water, but my throat went dry. I couldn't swallow. I had never asked to live in that apartment. I had never said I needed anyone's permission. I had lived on my farm for more than 10 years. Alone, quiet. Everything moved at my pace. And yet, in a single sentence in front of hundreds of people, my life was rearranged as if I weren't even there. I turned to look for Daniel. My son avoided my eyes just for a very brief second. Then he turned to Emily and nodded lightly, as if everything were unfolding exactly as planned. My heart sank. In that moment, I understood the first thing, and the most painful one. This was not a suggestion. It was not an awkward gesture of concern, and it was not a misunderstanding. This decision had already been made. My farm, the house I had bought, was with a lifetime of savings. The life I had built, piece by piece. Everything had been decided for me, and I was the last person to know. The applause still echoed somewhere, but I stood there, in the middle of a crowded hall, realizing that from this moment on, nothing would ever return to the way it was. As soon as the applause faded, Daniel stepped forward, standing closer to Emily. My son cleared his throat. I recognized that gesture immediately. Ever since he was little, whenever Daniel was nervous, he did that, as if he needed more time to swallow whatever he was about to say. "I was planning to talk about this later," Daniel began, his voice not loud but clear enough for the microphone to catch. "I didn't want to stir things up today." The hall gradually fell silent. Chairs stopped shifting. Whispered conversations softened, then disappeared. All eyes turned toward the stage. Daniel looked at me, just for a second. Then he turned to Emily as if seeking confirmation that he was doing the right thing. "But I think Mom should know now," he continued. "Emily's family has already moved into the farm." I stood frozen. "What did you say?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, not loud, not shaking, but thin and dry, as if it no longer belonged to me. Daniel didn't answer right away. He leaned down and adjusted the microphone. "They got there a few hours ago," he said, "while we were here for the ceremony." I heard someone inhale sharply. I wasn't sure if it was me or someone nearby, my farm, right now. Someone was inside it. "When did you ask for my permission?" I asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply asked, slowly, word by word. Daniel let out a long breath. "You know how big the place is," he said. his tone turning defensive. "So many empty rooms. It's a waste for you to live there alone." I looked straight at my son. "That's not an answer," I said. "When did you ask me?" Daniel avoided my eyes. "It's just temporary," he continued as if he hadn't heard my question. "Emily's family is having a hard time. They're family, Mom." Family. The word echoed in my head, but it sounded unfamiliar. "How long is temporary?" I asked. "A few days, a few weeks, or is there no end date?" Daniel frowned. I saw a flash of irritation cross my son's face, not because of the awkward situation, but because I wasn't following the script he expected. "Why do you have to make everything so tense?" Daniel said. "I thought you'd understand." "Why didn't you tell me beforehand?" I asked. "Why was my life decided without me even knowing?" Daniel paused. The hall began to murmur. I could feel the shift in the room, the way the looks were changing. No longer pure approval, no longer pure sympathy. Now there was curiosity, judgment. Then Daniel said the sentence I never thought I would hear, at least not in this setting. "Because I knew you'd react like this," he said. "You always only think about yourself." My chest tightened. "What did you just say?" I asked. Daniel stared straight ahead, no longer looking at me. "You're selfish," he said, clearly, without hesitation. "Emily's family doesn't have a stable place to live. And you're alone on a huge farm. You have too much, while other people have nothing." The entire hall fell silent. No music, no clinking glasses. Only a heavy stillness hanging over everyone's heads. I heard someone whisper behind me. I saw a few people look away. Others looked at me differently than they had before. I stood there in the middle of the crowd, listening to my own son call me selfish on his wedding day. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. A line had been crossed. From this point on, nothing would remain a private family matter anymore. Before I continue with what happened afterwards, I would like to pause for a moment. If you are listening to this and you have ever been someone who quietly sacrificed for your family, someone who got used to giving in just to keep the peace, someone who believed that enduring a little more yourself would make others happier, then you may understand how I felt in that moment. There are times when we stay silent, not because we are wrong, but because we have grown used to putting others ahead of ourselves for far too long. If you want to continue listening to real stories about family, parents, and people who have lived through many years and are forced to make difficult choices when life demands change, I invite you to subscribe and stay. Here, no one judges who is right or wrong. No one forces you to think in only one way. We simply listen together, reflect together, and learn how to respect ourselves just a little more. My story is not over yet, and perhaps, somewhere within it, you will see a reflection of yourself. My husband passed away when I was only 32 years old. He died from illness, faster than anything I could have prepared for. On an ordinary morning, he had promised he would fix the fence behind the house over the weekend. A few months later, I was standing in a cold hospital room, holding the hand of a man who had grown painfully thin, listening to a doctor say words I would never forget. From that day on, I became a widow, and Daniel was only 6. I didn't have time to fall apart for long, not because I was stronger than others, but because I had no choice. I had a child who needed to eat, to study, to grow up, and I was the only one he had. I applied for a job at a warehouse near town. The work didn't require a degree, just strength, lining up shipments, lifting boxes, checking orders, and cleaning up. The morning shift started at 6. I often left the house while it was still dark, leaving Daniel asleep, his forehead pressed against an old pillow. A typical workday began with the smell of dust and the sound of forklifts. My back ached. My arms were sore. Some boxes were so heavy that I had to pause for a few seconds just to catch my breath before lifting them. But I got used to it. People get used to more than they think. After my shift, I rushed home to pick up my son. On days when I worked overtime, I would often come back late. Daniel had already eaten dinner at a neighbor's house. Sometimes he fell asleep on the couch, his school bag still unopened. I would gently carry him to bed, tuck him in, and sit beside him for a long while, just watching him breathe. On nights like that, I often sat alone in the kitchen, sipping a cup of cold tea and thinking about my life. I once had dreams, nothing grand. I wanted to study accounting and have a lighter job when I grew older, but that dream was folded up and tucked away in a deep corner, making room for tuition, food, and rent. Daniel grew up with rushed mornings when I woke him up, with simple dinners and with my apologies for not being able to buy him the shoes he liked right away. He never complained. He was a good child, quiet, independent from an early age. Once when Daniel was 8, he came down with a high fever. I was working the afternoon shift when the school called. I asked to leave early and practically ran to the infirmary. He was lying there, his face flushed, his hand gripping my shirt tightly when he saw me. That night, I stayed awake, changing cold towels, checking his temperature, and sitting by his bedside until he finally fell asleep peacefully. When the fever passed, he looked at me and said softly, "Mom, don't worry. When I grow up, I'll take care of you." That sentence stayed with me for many years. I worked harder, took extra shifts, accepted back pain, joint pain, and exhaustion. I told myself that as long as my child had a better life, everything was worth it. I became used to enduring, used to not complaining, used to thinking of others first. And gradually, I also became used to not setting boundaries. I rarely said no to Daniel. When he wanted extra classes, I found a way to make the money work. When he wanted to change schools, I agreed, even though it made life more complicated. As he grew older, there were decisions I didn't truly understand. But I stayed silent because I thought I shouldn't stand in his way. Perhaps I taught my son something without realizing it, that I was always willing to give in, that everything I had could be adjusted so he could be more comfortable. I don't blame Daniel entirely. I understand that people learn how to treat others from what they grow accustomed to. And Daniel grew up with a mother who always stepped back. There were nights when I came home very late and he was already asleep. I stood outside his bedroom door, looking in, wondering if I was doing the right thing, whether sacrificing everything truly helped him become someone who knew how to appreciate others. But I pushed those thoughts away. I was tired. I needed sleep so I could work the next day again. Years passed like that. Daniel grew up, attended college, graduated, and secured a good job. I was proud. I cried at his graduation. I believed that everything I had traded away had finally meant something. But looking back, I also began to understand something I had never dared to think before. Perhaps I, too, was at fault. Not because I loved my son, but because I loved him without setting limits. I never taught him that I was also a human being, with needs, with personal space, with things that could not be decided for me. I never told him that love does not mean control. Realizing this didn't ease the pain, but it made me clearer-headed. I no longer see myself as a perfect mother. I am simply a woman who did the best she could with what she knew at the time. And now I must learn a lesson later than most, how to stand up for myself even at 65. My past is not meant to seek credit. It is meant to understand why I stayed silent for so long, and why, on that day, I could no longer stay silent anymore. The first signs did not come all at once. They came slowly, gently, just enough for me to convince myself that nothing was wrong. When Daniel told me about the wedding, I was happy for him. I asked a straightforward question. How can I help? The answer came quickly, but it was short. No need, Mom. Emily's family is taking care of everything. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I told myself that things are different nowadays. Having someone else handle the planning is a standard approach. I didn't want to interfere, and I certainly didn't want to be seen as a difficult mother-in-law. But then, the calls between Daniel and me became shorter. I called. He answered. "I'm in a meeting, Mom." "Can you be quick?" I asked if the wedding date had been finalized. "Yes, Mom. I'll send it later." I asked about the venue. It's out in the suburbs. It's beautiful. Then he hung up. He wasn't angry. He didn't raise his voice. He was just rushed. Always rushed. There were times when I sent a message to check in. It took a whole day to get a reply. Sometimes it was just one word, yes, or I'm fine, Mom. I stared at the screen, reread my own message, then set the phone down. I began to feel like I was standing outside something significant. One afternoon, I decided to drive to the event center where they planned to hold the wedding. I didn't tell anyone beforehand. I just wanted to see the place, to imagine where my son would stand, how he would smile. Inside, preparations were already underway. Decorators moved around. Flowers were arranged in large pots. I stood quietly in a corner, observing. The Carter family was there. They spoke loudly, they directed, they discussed details. Emily's mother stood in the middle of the room, pointing, making decisions. I stood nearby, unnoticed. No one asked who I was, no one invited me closer. Daniel noticed me later. He looked startled. Mom, what are you doing here? I just wanted to take a look. He nodded and smiled faintly, but his eyes flicked toward Emily, as if afraid someone might misunderstand. Then he added, You should go home. It's crowded here. Not convenient. I nodded. I left. In the car, I sat still for a long time before starting the engine. In the days that followed, I learned more details from other people, not from my own son. The color of the flowers, the number of guests. The seating arrangements. I was the groom's mother, yet I received every piece of information late. As the wedding day drew closer, Daniel finally called me about the seating arrangements. You'll be seated at the table next to the main table, Mom. I was silent for a few seconds. I won't be sitting with you? He hesitated. Emily's family is large. They have a tradition of sitting together. I didn't say anything else. I simply replied, Okay. After hanging up, I sat there looking at my small kitchen. I thought about the dinners we used to share together, about the times I sat across from him, listening to stories about school, about work. And now, on the most important day of his life, I was assigned to a side table. I began to understand, but I still didn't want to believe it. Daniel wasn't avoiding me because he disliked me. He was just being cautious. I knew that. He was avoiding me because he was afraid of upsetting Emily, afraid of offending her family, and perhaps he believed that I would, once again, give in. I had given in many times before, given up my time, my wishes, even my voice. Daniel had grown used to it, and I was the one who had taught him to believe that I was always fine with standing behind everyone else. In the days leading up to the wedding, I prepared my belongings, simple dresses. No one told me what color to wear. No one asked if I needed anything. I did everything myself, as I always had. Inside me was an extraordinary feeling. Not anger, not jealousy, but a slow, unmistakable separation, as if I were gradually being pushed outside a circle I once stood very close to the center of. I kept telling myself, maybe I was too sensitive, maybe I was overthinking, maybe on the wedding day everything would feel different. But deep down, I had already begun to feel something I had never felt before. I was no longer someone whose opinion was asked. I was someone who was simply informed. After Daniel finished speaking, the hall fell into a strange silence. No one was laughing anymore. There was no applause, only eyes fixed on me. I stood there, among tables covered in white cloths, among half-finished glasses of wine, and for the first time in my life, I understood one thing very clearly. If I stayed silent now, I would stay silent forever. I set my glass down. My hands were still trembling, but my voice was not. I will say this only once, I said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. No one is allowed to live in my house without my consent. Someone inhaled sharply. Some people turned to look at one another. Others lowered their heads toward the table. Daniel stared at me, his eyes wide. Mom, what are you doing? He said quietly but tensely. Don't make things worse. I looked straight at my son. "Worse for whom?" I asked. "For you or for me?" No one answered. Emily stood beside Daniel, her lips pressed tight. The Carter family remained silent, but their eyes were no longer friendly. I didn't wait for anyone else to speak. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I had said enough. I turned around. The first step was very hard, not because the floor was slippery, but because my heart was pounding too fast. I walked down the aisle where, just minutes earlier, Emily had walked in her white wedding dress. Now I walked through it in my simple dress between two rows of people watching me pass. There were looks of pity, looks of blame, looks of shock. I stopped looking for Daniel. I knew that if I turned back, I would hesitate, and I would not allow myself to do that. The large doors of the banquet hall were right ahead. I pushed them open. The outside air hit my face, colder, more real. I took a deep breath. For the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe. Behind me, someone called out. I didn't know who it was. I didn't turn around. I stepped down the stairs. My shoes touched the cold concrete. The wind brushed my shoulders. I pulled my coat closer, but not because I was cold. I was trembling for a different reason. I had broken a habit that had lasted more than 30 years, the habit of staying silent to keep the peace. The habit of reminding myself to understand others before thinking about myself. I walked to my car, opened the door, sat down, closed it. The sounds of the outside world were shut out. In that moment, there was only me and the sound of my own breathing. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew one thing with absolute clarity. I had stood up, and I would not sit down again. The road leading back to the farm was darker than I expected. I had driven down that road hundreds of times, but that night everything looked different. The streetlights were sparse. The wind moved through the rows of trees on either side, creating a familiar rustling sound that felt cold and unsettling. When I was just a few dozen meters from the farm, my heart suddenly sank. The gate was open. I always locked the gate. Always. It was a habit I had kept for years of living alone. I slowed down and drove more carefully. The lights in the house were on, not just in one room, but all of them, as if this place had already become someone else's home. I parked in front of the porch. I sat still for a few seconds, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I wondered if I was overreacting. Perhaps I should turn back and speak with Daniel first. But then I remembered the look in his eyes at the reception hall and the word selfish he had used. I stepped out of the car. The front door was unlocked. I pushed gently. The door opened so easily that it sent a chill through me. Inside, the smell of unfamiliar food filled the air. Not anything I usually cook. The lights were bright. Shoes were scattered near the entrance. There were suitcases, cardboard boxes, coats hanging on hooks that I had never seen before. I walked into the living room. There was a cup of coffee on the table, still warm. Blankets and pillows lay on the sofa, clearly used. The TV was on, the volume low, as if they had been living there for a long time. Voices came from the kitchen. Linda Carter stood at the stove, cooking. Richard sat at the table, looking at his phone. Emily wasn't there. But I didn't need to see her to know that none of them thought there was anything wrong. Linda turned around, saw me, and smiled, a disturbingly natural smile. "Oh, Margaret, you're home. We're making dinner. Daniel said you wouldn't be eating here." I stood at the kitchen doorway. "What are you doing in my house?" I asked. Richard looked up, frowning slightly. "There seems to be some misunderstanding. Daniel already talked to you." "Daniel does not have the right to give you permission to be here," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was very clear. Linda sighed and set the spoon down. "Margaret, don't make things awkward. We're only staying temporarily. Your house is big. You don't use all of it living alone." Those phrases again. Big house. Temporary. Family. I felt my head tighten, but I kept my voice calm. I never agreed, and I do not agree now. Richard stood up. He was slightly taller than me and stepped closer. You should think about your son. Daniel is under a lot of pressure. I stepped back half a step, not out of fear, but because I needed space to breathe. I will call my lawyer, I said. Linda gave a thin smile. Call whoever you want. Taking family matters to court looks bad. I turned and went into my bedroom. I closed the door and sat down on the bed. My hands shook as I held the phone. I stared at the screen for a long time before dialing. My lawyer didn't answer immediately. I left a message. While waiting, I sat there, listening to them moving around in the living room. Laughter, the clinking of dishes. What I felt then wasn't anger. It was a violation. The lawyer called back later. He spoke slowly and clearly. You are the legal owner. They have no lease or agreement. If you've told them they cannot stay, you have the right to ask them to leave. If they refuse, you can call the police. I hung up and looked at the phone in my hand. Call the police. I had never imagined doing that to my son's family. I walked back into the living room. I'm giving you 48 hours, I said. Pack your things and leave. Linda laughed. Are you serious? I'm very serious. Richard shook his head. Daniel won't let this go. I don't have another choice, I replied. Those 2 days were the longest I had ever lived through. I locked myself in my room. I heard them talk about me as if I didn't exist. I heard them calling Daniel. I heard them laugh at me. By the evening of the second day, they still hadn't left. I stood in the kitchen, holding my phone. My finger hovered over the screen. I hesitated for a long time. If I called, everything would go too far. There would be no turning back. But if I didn't call, I would lose my home. I dialed. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers, calm, polite. They asked for documents. I handed over the property deed and ownership papers. They scrutinized them. Then they turned to the Carter family. Do you have a lease or any written permission? Linda mentioned Daniel. The officers shook their heads. That person is not the legal owner. Richard stayed silent. In the end, they began packing their things. No one looked at me. No one said anything else. When their car drove out through the gate, dust rose into the air. I stood there, my arms hanging loosely at my sides. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt exhausted. My house was quiet again. Too quiet. I locked the gate, locked the doors, sat down on a chair in the living room. I had protected my farm, but the price I would have to pay, I still didn't know how high it would be. The first night after everything ended, I slept alone in a house that felt larger than usual. There were no unfamiliar footsteps, no voices coming through the walls, only the silence I had once longed for. Yet that night, it made my heart ache. I lay in bed, staring at the familiar ceiling. The clock ticked steadily. I waited for my phone to vibrate, for a call, a message, a simple question like, "Are you okay, Mom?" There was nothing. Daniel cut off contact. In the days that followed, my phone was strangely silent. No more short calls, no more rushed messages. This silence was different from before. It was intentional. It had distance. It was a choice. I was sad. I won't deny that. Some mornings, I stood in the kitchen making coffee, looking at the chair across from me, and I would suddenly think of Daniel. I thought of when he was little, sitting there eating breakfast, laughing nonstop. I thought of the person I had raised, and the person who had called me selfish in front of so many people. But strangely, within that sadness, I didn't feel regret. I was sad because I had lost my son, but I did not regret standing up for myself. One afternoon, my neighbor Sarah stopped by. She brought a warm apple pie. She didn't ask many questions. She just set the pie on the table and said, "I heard what happened. You did the right thing." We sat on the porch. A light breeze passed by. I told her everything, without adding or leaving out anything. Sarah listened without interrupting. "Margaret," she said after a while, "many people our age have nothing left. No home, no voice, you still have both. Those words stayed with me for a long time. From that day on, I began fixing up the farm. Not to forget what had happened, but to affirm that I was still here. I changed the locks, repainted the fence, cleaned every corner of the house that the Carter family had touched. Every brushstroke of paint, every nail I hammered in made me feel as if I were reclaiming something I had lost. A week later, I met with my lawyer. Sitting in the small office, I held the pen and signed my will. My hand didn't shake. I read every line, my assets, my house, my decisions. When I finished signing, I set the pen down and let out a long breath. For the first time in my life, I felt that I had regained control of my own life. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through clarity. That evening, I sat alone in the living room. Soft yellow light, familiar space. I drank tea, listened to the wind outside, and came to a realization. Loneliness is not as frightening as living an entire life without the right to choose. I still miss Daniel. I still love him. But I am no longer willing to trade my peace for a relationship that only exists when I stay silent. I lost my son for a period of time, but I found myself again. And that is something I never thought I could do at 65. We met again after nearly 6 months without any contact. Not at the farm, not over a family meal, but by chance, in a small cafe near the town market. I was sitting there, reading the newspaper, when I saw Daniel standing at the counter ordering a drink. He looked thinner. His shoulders sloped slightly. The confidence he had on his wedding day was gone. When Daniel saw me, he froze for a few seconds. Then he walked over. "Mom?" Just that one word was enough to tighten my chest. I nodded. "Daniel." We sat down. Neither of us spoke for the first few minutes. The coffee machine hummed steadily. Outside the window, people passed by as usual, as if the world had never been shaken. "I'm sorry," Daniel finally said. His voice was hoarse. "I've thought a lot." I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched on. Not to punish him, but because I needed to be sure of what I was feeling. The pain hadn't disappeared. It was still there. Settled deep, not loud, but unmistakable. "I was wrong," Daniel continued. "I let others make decisions for you. I called you selfish. I didn't protect you." He lowered his head. His hands rested on the table, trembling slightly. I looked at my son for a long time. Images flooded my mind. The child who once promised to take care of me, the young man on his graduation day, and the man who had turned his back on me in the most critical moment. "Daniel," I said slowly, "I hear what you're saying, but I need you to understand something." He looked up. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you apologized, but because I don't want to carry resentment for the rest of my life." He broke down in tears, but I raised my hand, signaling him to stop. "Forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was," I continued. "Trust was damaged. It takes time to rebuild, and it takes action." Daniel nodded repeatedly. "I understand. I truly do." "You will never make decisions for me again," I said. "You will respect my boundaries, and your relationship with Emily and her family is your choice, but it cannot come at the expense of respect for me." Daniel looked at me, his eyes red. "I promise." I didn't ask for anything more. I didn't test that promise right then and there. I knew that words are far easier than actions. We sat for a while longer, talking about lighter things. The weather, his job, my garden. No one mentioned the wedding, no one mentioned the Carter family. When we stood to leave, Daniel hugged me gently, not tightly, not for long, but enough for me to know he was trying. On the drive home, I thought about that meeting. I didn't feel weak for having forgiven him. I felt lighter. This time, forgiveness was not about forgetting. It was about embracing the past. It was a choice I made for myself. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need praise for being a forgiving mother. I only needed to live the rest of my life without letting the past hold me prisoner. And if Daniel truly changes, It will come from his respect for boundaries, not from my silence, as it was before. That afternoon, I sat on the front porch again. The late sunlight stretched across the familiar yard. A gentle breeze moved through the trees I had planted many years ago. Everything was the same, but I was not. In front of me, the farm gate was locked. Not locked out of fear, but because I had learned how to protect what belongs to me. I took a sip of warm tea and listened to the quiet around me. There was no more unease, no more worry that someone might walk into my home without permission, no more fear of having to please everyone. I thought of Daniel, of our meeting at the cafe, of his awkward but sincere apology. I didn't know what the future of our relationship would look like. It might improve. It might take a long time. But I was no longer anxious. I had come to understand something I had never allowed myself to think before. Love is not unconditional endurance. Love is not silence in the face of hurt. And sacrifice does not mean giving up the right to decide your own life. Older people deserve respect, not because they are weak, but because they have spent their entire lives building, preserving, and giving without asking for much in return. I also understood that forgiveness, done the right way, does not make us smaller. On the contrary, it can open the door for others to reflect on themselves, to change, to grow. But forgiveness only has meaning when it comes with boundaries, with clarity, with self-respect. I stood up and walked slowly along the porch, running my hand along the wooden railing. I looked toward the garden, where the trees I planted continued to grow day by day, unhurried, needing no one's permission. My life is the same. I am no longer trying to please everyone. I only need to live in a way that honors what I deserve. I stepped inside the house and closed the door. The warm yellow light turned on, familiar and comforting. Everything was in its proper place. This is my home. This is my life. And for the first time in many years, I felt a true sense of peace.